Welcome
Right.
back. This time we again have the privilege of having Irina Tsukerman with Scarab Rising and also an expert on geopolitics or economic and geopolitical topics. And this time we are gathered to discuss the evolution of the Sino-Russian or China-Russia relationship. We find in public in mass media from people who inspired in 1968 believe that they can find cracks between China and Russia and bring Putin back to the West, which in my opinion is naive. To those who believe they represent a unified front against the West, which also lacks nuance. So, what's your take on this issue?
We're seeing is that Russia's and China's cooperation is growing in all areas. That's not to say that they're not competing or that there are tensions. They're both spying on each other, for example. They're competing for influence in Central Asia, where Russia is rapidly losing ground, while China is gaining ground largely thanks to its BRI initiative and economic infusions. Nevertheless, Russia still cannot be completely discounted, and moreover, Russia is also attempting to mitigate the damage from its economic limitations by joining China on a number of initiatives, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, not to mention BRICS. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in my opinion, is by far the more serious effort of the two. BRICS is basically there to evade and circumvent U.S. sanctions to develop model to get around the SWIFT system. And it has its limitations. There's been also talk about de-dollarization. That's not likely to happen. The biggest the biggest threat to the dollar is inflation and overspending, not the yuan or some fictitious currency that is unlikely to happen due to the vast differences between the economies in BRICS and lack of trust. But Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a defense organization. It involves elements of joint trainings and security, and it has succeeded in drawing in not only Central Asian but also Southeast Asian countries, including rivals such as India and Pakistan, which at various points have cooperated with both the West and Russia and China, as we're seeing increasingly complex geopolitical landscape. Um, and and frankly, the West has not been paying as much attention as it should. That's of course not the only area of cooperation. China has recently issued a statement saying that they cannot allow Russia to lose the war in Ukraine, and China has been steadily supporting Russia, albeit not as openly or as systematically as North Korea and Iran. It nevertheless has provided various components for weapons. It has provided light ammunition, assorted non-lethal aid, and most importantly, an economic lifeline. And we're seeing now shipments from China that are going either to Russia or to other areas. We have seen energy exchanges between the two countries. So there's a lot going on. Not all of it is in broad daylight. China still wants to evade being designated for U.S. sanctions. It has also provided important cybersecurity component to Russia, not only specific to the war in Ukraine, but also in terms of espionage, including industrial espionage and assorted hacking efforts around the world, despite the fact that China and Russia generally have a different style and a different approach to cybersecurity. In terms of anti-Western operations, there has been visible cooperation between the two areas. And of course, There's more general economic and trade exchanges and high-level visits. For instance, Xi has visited Russia in a high-profile visit in May of this year. Putin has frequented Beijing, and their talks of bilateral cooperation actually have increased even more, if you can believe it, in 2025. So,
And now that you mentioned the Central Asia is also in the Caucasus, right? Because Azerbaijan is trying to stand more independent from Russia. And is China taking part in all this?
oh, of course. China is uh, exploiting U.S. absence in the South Caucasus. Up until recently, Brussels has essentially stepped back from active engagement due to the difficulties in negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and the U.S. has been absent due to other commitments and lack of interest. Finally, the Trump administration is starting to step up its interest in the local issues, but not nearly enough, and not from an economic perspective. It's focusing more on the security, some geopolitical aspects, but the solutions provided so far are difficult to realize. For instance, Tom Barrack, the U.S. envoy to Turkey, ambassador to Turkey, basically suggested that U.S. should take over the critical Zangezur corridor mm, and administer it for 100 years through a commercial company. This is not necessarily a very serious suggestion. It could provide some logistical and digital support, but the physical presence is unlikely to happen, nor would it be necessarily desired by all of the regional actors. China is bypassing these diplomatic difficulties, instead focusing on infrastructure, language, cultural exchanges, and high-level diplomatic posturing, including assorted MOUs signed with President Aliyev when he visited earlier this year. This was actually a message to the West to get back to treating South Caucasus as a strategically important area or face the consequences of China growing close in the region, but that message seems to have been lost on the Trump administration, at least in the economic sense. Nevertheless, the relations continue to remain largely positive, but not nearly as close as Azerbaijan would like it to be. And of course, Georgia, another actor, is playing all sides. It's looking for Western support in terms of energy projects, but it's also looking to make money from deals with China.
Yeah,
Well,
and the Transcaspian, and are the Chinese investing in the Transcaspian pipeline?
They very much are interested in that project. Of course, we don't know whether that project will ultimately bear out, given Russia's interest in all that, and Russia's stake in this. This is where the cooperation between China and Russia can quickly grow into an area of competition. Energy projects and connectivity projects in general are the two areas where the cooperation can quickly descend into chaos or tensions due to the economic stakes of the frenemy parties and individual country interests. China and Russia are most likely to cooperate against the West, most likely to compete when it comes to more internal dynamics around projects that the West is not necessarily particularly involved in. And Transcaspian is one of those projects that is very specific to the regional area and where the U.S. is not the has not been on top of its game in terms of watching what is going on. So that's one of the impediments to U.S. success. I would say that overall, what we are seeing is the emergence of a China-Russia axis, and especially Eurasian challenges, despite some competing elements. It's not simply opportunism by two countries that need um, assistance from each other. It's also a very systemic partnership that we are seeing growing to defy Western dominance, to reshape global rules of engagement. China's been all about it, both rhetorically and politically. The push for multipolarity from both China and Russia. Dugin's philosophy is all about creating this Eurasian alliance, and to the fact that Russia is sacrificing elements of its nationalistic dynamic and nationalistic language to support what it used to be the worst episode of Russian history, the Tatar-Mongol invasion, is now being praised. In order to attract China and strengthen the partnership, and also in order to strengthen the spread of Dugin's Eurasian future vision that imagines Eurasia without borders, basically a quasi empire resurrected under the uh, with the Russian influence and Chinese support. They are also offering authoritarian states a model of mutual survival in the face of external pressure. And moreover, they're not just simply offering a positive example of how such a partnership can be possible, but they're exporting their own models abroad. China is exporting its surveillance state model to the Middle East, to Iran, Saudi Arabia, other countries. They're exporting their defense cooperation to countries like UAE and other Gulf states. Russia and Qatar, for instance, part of the same gas cartel with Iran, but they're also exporting cyber operations, administrative models, and intelligence and information warfare techniques to those countries, not just in the Gulf, but also in Latin America, Africa, and even European countries. So they're looking to literally dominate the world through means, China through a more economic but also increasingly a military approach, Russia more through politics, lobbying, chaos. It's a traditional controlled chaos model, but jointly they're able to do so much more effectively by capitalizing on local corruption, financial and economic vulnerabilities, and polarization.
But it's my impression that before the war, uh, there was a relationship between China and Russia, of course. What you have mentioned, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that even the first time I learned of it was in the 90s from a book by Kevin Phillips. It's Mad Money. And the matter is that before the war, China preferred a more nuanced approach. It means they tried to diversify their energy sources. So even early into the war, they preferred the Turkmenistan pipeline to Siberia too. They prefer Ukrainian grain to Russian grain. So the relationship existed on paper, but it was not that close. Even the Chinese banks were reluctant to process transactions that could fallen under the sanctions imposed by the West. But more recently, as you mentioned, there is even a more close, a more open cooperation between the two. And correct me if I am wrong. Right now, they are even helping Russian drone production with up to 80% of the drones produced by Russia. Right? There has
Uh,
been an evolution of this relationship.
Yes, correct. The weapons production is certainly receiving a lot of Chinese support, and Russia has also been cooperating with Iran, but the Shahid factory in Russia has been hit by Ukrainians on multiple occasions, I believe, and damaged. And also, Iran has suffered heavy internal losses after the recent military strikes by airstrikes on its military facilities by Israel, which has impeded its efforts to assist Russia, and this is where China is stepping up to the plate. And this relationship, this even alliance, is now has helped to prolong the war in Ukraine. It helped destabilize Europe's security environment. It helped to challenge US diplomatic influence in the global south. Now, admittedly, many analysts have correctly noted that Russia is not a reliable security partner. For instance, it has concluded a security agreement with Iran, which was essentially a mutual defense treaty. And of course, when Iran was attacked, Russia did not come to assistance, which precipitated a visit by Arakchi and some comments by the ambassador and other officials from Iran about Russia needing to do more. And this is not the first time this happened. Russia has in the past also reneged on its obligations to provide assistance, which means I'm not sure China could really count on Russia in terms of any serious military support in the event of a military confrontation over Taiwan or over other disputed territories in the South China Sea. Rather, but Russia is likely to continue assisting China with logistics, intelligence, mutual weapon production, sanctions evasions, and the energy issues as well. So there are limits to this cooperation, even at the best of times, simply because Russia is a weak, economically weak country, chaotic country with a lot of distrust even at the top level. B, it's still a competitor, and C, it's not it's known to not be a particularly reliable friend in times of need. But the longer this partnership continues building, the more institutionalized and resilient it's likely to become. There's always going to be some level of tensions. China, after all, is aiming to take back through stealth some of the Russian territories that were originally Chinese and that are essentially empty of Russians. There's also its continuous cautious hedging against the West and sanctions, and Russia is always suspicious of China. And frankly, culturally, the two countries are very different, and there's a lot of racism in Russia against China. But these issues are being overshadowed by seeing the West less and less as a partner and more as an adversary to be outmaneuvered, weakened, and displaced. So even as China is looking to capitalize on the European markets through the dumping of EVs and other products, it's at the same time looking to exploit the West rather than to partner with the West.
Yeah, that's correct. And yet, much of this approach, much of this closer relationship between China and Russia has been favored by the West policy of pushing Xi Jinping in the direction of Putin, right? Because it's for China starts before the war, their investment, for instance, on defense, on their navy was not that significant. But the more the West started to adopt a hard stance against China, Xi Jinping started increasing more and more their spending on defense. We started collaborating more and more closer with Russia. So is that correct?
I would say that in some extent, it certainly accelerated the divisions between the West and China, the crackdown for national security reasons, certainly the economic nationalism of Donald Trump accelerated this process as well. But there were also internal factors that were independent of the West's
Mm,
suspicion of China, such as Xi's own rising nationalism and his
mhm.
independent actions to attack foreign interests, not just the United States and not only countries that have been increasingly closed to China. Of course, there's been the war over critical elements and the chip war. Of course, there's been a lot of tit for tat accusations related to spying and so forth. But there's been also independent efforts by China to harm the US, and that's been going on for years, long before Donald Trump or any of these tariff-related measures, such as the industrial espionage. There's nothing new about the collection of and targeting of U.S. intellectual property, both for weapons and other technological development purposes. There's been, the targeting of Chinese diaspora in the West, the increasing aggressive spying efforts, and of course the wave of fentanyl production aimed at weakening and destabilizing the US from within. That's an entirely unilateral initiative by China, not provoked by anything specific by the West.
Yeah, so Xi Jinping is different from Hu Jintao. Not that before Xi Jinping, as you mentioned, there was no intellectual property theft, or in the early 2000s currency manipulation, and other tricks, how they broke their world in Hong Kong, and some other issues. But with Xi Jinping, there is a terrible combination of a harder stance on China with an ultra-nationalist position that is represented to a point in Xi Jinping. But my question was because in the long term, what China wants is not closer relation or competition with the West, but a dominant position in this global South. And precisely all these tensions damage to a point their position in the global South, and especially in East Asia, where, for instance, all this bravado in the South China Sea has caused China some position, some influence with respect to the United States, despite the the effects of American policy in emerging markets, from the Federal Reserve policy to this constant increases in interest rates to fight inflation, how they affected the currencies of these countries in emerging markets, forced them to increase their own interest rates to avoid appreciations of their own currencies. So to now Trump's tariff. So there is a ground on which China has been able to capitalize for this long term, and yet we see this in the short term, this hardened stance of the West policy on geopolitical issues is hurting to appoint these long-term goals of the Chinese in the global South, right?
Definitely China is looking to take a lead there, but China's path towards that has not been smooth. Still, China relies mostly on economic endeavors for that
Hmm.
regard. For a very long time, it relied on debt diplomacy, which essentially drew developing countries into infrastructural contracts that had to be paid off later, that they could not necessarily afford to do, which resulted in China confiscating critical infrastructure such as ports, and that resulted in a lot of tension. So China eventually changed that model to become more of a um, partnership, and has tried to affect African and Latin American and Asian countries in that way. Still, you cannot say that that diplomacy project has completely moved away. Another problem with China's involvement has been that China always preferred to bring in its own workers for any of these projects. So it was not a big source of local employment and thus less advantageous for these countries. There's breeding resentment, even in countries like Iran that are very close with China on many levels. There's been a lot of cultural miscommunications and just very tactical issues that on a strategic level are not as visible. So China has not been an easy country to partner with. Russia has economic limitations, but has recently attempted to use assorted resources, whether from oligarchs or from stolen gold from African mines, or whatever it is, to replace the United States as a humanitarian aid facilitator. Up until this point, Russia mostly relied on security paradigm, securitization of state actors, which has failed. We're seeing that in West Africa, for instance, jihadist groups are taking over, and the Russia-backed juntas, which replaced the elected governments, are struggling to keep these movements and assorted separatists at bay. Russia's Wagner group, before it was integrated into the military, was essentially losing ground to assorted Islamist convocations in various African countries. So its model of securitization was far from perfect. Moreover, while Russia's been an enormous source of low-level propaganda in various states, in terms of any sort of practical assistance, it's been very limited. The closest it came to any sort of real ingrained cooperation was with Assad Syria before his downfall, where the schools were starting to do cultural exchanges with Russia, renew the Soviet model, and starting to study Russian in schools, but with the Al-Sharaa, who's much closer to Turkey, all of that has come to an end, I believe. Um, so Russia has had to struggle in that sense, but its support for assorted pro-Russian strongmen in European countries has been more successful, and also in Latin America. Uh, these people have not revitalized the Russian language studies and things like that, but they have been um, open to promulgating a pro-Russian mindset in the population, and essentially propagating um, the Russian vision of multipolarity, of Eurasianism, pan-Slavism, and all of these issues. So in that ideological regard, I would say Russia has actually been pretty successful. China has been more pragmatic, less concerned with spreading communism, and more concerned about countering support for Taiwan and for the West, and just attracting supporters through economic, practical means and less through ideological means.
Yeah, but it's true that both China and Russia has championed the message of multilateralism, and yet in the practice, what they practice is almost a 19th century model of areas of influence. And in the case of Russia, but there is a difference as I can see, because as you mentioned, China prefers economic diplomacy. So China is willing to play with Chavez, with Maduro in Venezuela, but is not a promoter of democracy, but is not contributing to toppling democracies. In the case of Russia, they are more on the side of supporting strongmen where they find them. So that's the case of Afghanistan recently, and the Sahel in the recent past with Wagner, and now with the Africa Corps, right?
I would say that yes, overall that's correct, but China has also been trying to infiltrate the democracies from within and take control of them rather than topple them. For instance,
Mm-hmm.
it has been trying to spread some cultural influence through TikTok lately. For instance, it failed in India. India banned it in 2021. In the US, trying to ban it has been a struggle, and Donald Trump specifically has been giving TikTok a lifeline. But it's been a huge method for China to infiltrate Western countries, manipulate local mindset, and TikTok is active not just in the United States but all over the Western world, and it's a different model from what the Chinese use themselves at home. The stupid challenges about putting NyQuil on chicken, or eating Tide Pods, or committing suicide, all of that has been aimed at the Western youth to manipulate them to weaken the West, and to make it more easy to infiltrate. Tons of propaganda, pro-Chinese, anti-Western, pro-terrorist, and so forth. All of that is very much a TikTok-driven effort, and it has been successful in the US and also in other places as well. People, for whatever reason, see TikTok as a major place for influencing, for fighting social media battles, and even without any of these other negative elements, China has already succeeded in that regard by making people addicted to its controlled um, avenue for collecting information, for targeting people for future recruitment, or uh, um, for sabotage, or all sorts of reasons. It's not. China has also not given up at uh, for given up its Confucius model. Confucius institutes have been largely banned in the U.S., but they're still active in various European spaces, and they are the main spread of ideological propaganda in painting a positive image of China and whitewashing events such as the Tiananmen Square massacre. The AI model, like DeepSeek, that China has produced, also uses these elements of narrative control increasingly. China uses diaspora for spreading narrative control in the West, creating a positive image of China. Increasingly, China has been re engaging with the media and journalists to try to kind of promulgate its own narratives and its own ideological disposition. So, no, it's not looking to topple democracies, but it has also been active in helping Russia in that regard. For instance, the Romanian election that nearly ended in a pro-Russian candidate being elected had a heavy use of TikTok in that election. So while China has not been the primary toppler of democracies, when Russia has asked for assistance, China was happy to provide it.
At least I don't have news that China has engaged in something like the hybrid war with assassination attempts, act of sabotage that Putin has engaged in Europe, right?
So far, we haven't seen that, but I wouldn't be surprised if China has offered logistical or intelligence assistance in that regard, and it has complemented with increasing aggression Russia's cyber strategy. For instance, the recent attack on the Czech facilities was a China uh, episode, although normally Chinese hackers aim for intelligence and access and for economic benefit and not for messaging. In this case, this sort of messaging had been more of a Russian tactic, but China is starting to imitate it, either because it's diversifying its own strategy or to assist Russia's efforts in that regard.
You mentioned in one of our previous conversations that, or probably correct me if if don't remember well, the influence of Russia's help in the reverse of terrorist movements like the Bader-Meinhof in Germany and even in Spain, separatist groups. And could you expand a bit more about this, elaborate more about this growth of terrorist movements inside Europe?
The truth is, the FSB and SVR and GRU and their assorted variants and all the name changes have not actually affected the Russia's security model or intelligence model since the last 500 years. It literally has not changed. The figureheads at the top have changed, but not the actual methods. So while Russia in the 90s was distracted and more focused on internal issues and the wars in Chechnya and the like, and less on exporting its strategy abroad, with the coming of Putin, there's been a resurgence in traditional tactics. The assets that were connected to Russia since the Soviet Union have never fully gone away. They have found a new lifeline, and for a while they cooperated with various terrorist organizations which emerged in the late 80s and 90s, like Al Qaeda and Hezbollah. But Russia has reignited these and given a new vision to these organizations due to an increasingly anti-Western sentiment. While Putin at one point was trying to get into NATO and was trying to uh, essentially strengthen Russia's positions by becoming part of these international organizations like G8, now G7. Some of these projects were on hold for obvious reasons, but once it became obvious that his vision of integrating into the international consensus while simultaneously invading countries like Georgia and Ukraine were contradictory in nature and were never going to get him support. Were only going to get him more isolated from the international structures. He became much more aggressive in reawakening these hidden assets that can be sleeping for decades only to be called upon to act at a moment's notice. That's the whole point of intelligence infrastructure. They create these networks that can be useful at a much later point, even if they've been recruited many years ago. We're seeing acts of sabotage all over Europe, but we're also seeing increasing Russian support for Islamist terrorist organizations. And one could say that Russia has actually actively contributed to the to ISIS through the Chechens, not only by alienating Chechens and radicalizing them and getting rid of all the secular nationalists in favor of controlled Islamists, but by essentially actively reinforcing the exportation of some of these people to Syria and Iraq back in the day, because it fit Russia's vision of uh, creating a problem for the West in the region and creating an opening for it to play a more active role in strategically valuable countries.
But for instance, in the case of the Bader-Meinhof or the
Hmm.
Red Army Brigade, what kind of help has Putin provided? Activating the coordination or between cells? What kind of specific help they have provided?
The most help these people get is in a very traditional handler relationship with their with these assets, providing access to weapons, financing, ideological instruction, logistical coordination, and essentially being kept safe from Western security services because we saw that in the last German raid, which resulted in the finding various weapons, at least two people from the cell managed to escape, and we still, after over a year, don't know where they are. So without assistance and without having an active network helping such people facilitate the escape, they would have been found a long time ago.
And I suppose they are replicating that model in Spain and other places.
Very actively so. We have seen that Russia made friends with the local separatist groups and essentially has funded them through cryptocurrency projects and through training and through very traditional cover stories for some of these active plots and espionage. They sent Russian intelligence officers on the journalistic cover to spy on borders with Poland, for instance, and Ukraine, and inside Poland, especially in other countries, to infiltrate Russian diasporas and to recruit from the political sphere as well. So they're using very traditional techniques. There's nothing particularly innovative about it other than it's much more diversified and much more active. And during the Soviet era, the training of terrorist groups in the Middle East was aimed at socialists. Now
Mhm.
these groups are mostly gone, or at least the socialist elements is largely in the background, and so Islamist groups, but also anybody who is available, are targets of Russian cooperation.
That brings me to the issue of that you mentioned, Al-Shara. One thing that is help me understand this. Um, the Netanyahu at first was complaining justifiably about Assad because Assad allowed this corridor between Iran and its proxies in other places of surrounding Israel. So, but then Al-Shara came to power, and he at least proclaimed to seek approval of the West. He claimed to be a repentant former Al Qaeda member. And yet you see Netanyahu trying to destabilize Al Sharaa because you say the Druze need protection, and I agree. But he could have used that as leverage precisely the attempts of Al Sharaa to get the approval from the West. So the West could condition that approval to provide improper security to the Druze against the Bedouins. On the other side, you have and why is this dangerous? Because Netanyahu wants to demilitarize the South precisely as ISIS is activating its fighters in Iraq and Syria. What creates a very fragile situation to Al Sharaa. So, and my question is, what is Putin's role on this?
Well, here's the thing. Putin has not necessarily encouraged the situation. He certainly benefits from it. He benefits from any chaos in Syria, and his rivalry with Turkey in that regard plays into the picture. The worst case scenario for Putin is if Israel comes to some sort of a security arrangement with Damascus and has a non-aggression pact that results in elements of economic cooperation and security coordination, because that will strengthen Israel's ability to control local networks and to control smuggling routes and avoid Russia from coming in and being able to take advantage of ex-Assad regime forces that are still part of the security establishment or local underground cells. So this actually benefits Putin a great deal. And in general, Israel's political isolation in the Arab world as a result of these attacks, and even those who are skeptical of al-Sharaa and his, foreign fighters and militias in the region do not support Israel's strike on Damascus proper from the state actors in the Middle East. I mean, and even the Trump administration has called to put an end to these airstrikes. So that leaves Israel isolated. Moreover, until the war in Gaza is over, it will be hard for Israel to portray itself as a liberator of the Druze or anybody else in the region, while not being seen as trying to distract from the humanitarian situation in Gaza. From this perspective of the region, we can argue about whether it's proportional or not proportional, whether Israel is artificially prolonging the war, whether Hamas propaganda has unfairly indoctrinated most of the region against Israel, and that's a fair point. But then again, Israel has not done anything to really engage with the region on a popular level and to change that perspective for what it's worth. So all of that is actually playing into Russia's hand. That said, it still will be difficult for Russia to return to Syria until the way it was under Assad, simply because for now al-Sharaa still enjoys a lot of Western support. Should that change? Should al-Sharaa lose his ability to control the situation even more than he already has, and should the Western investors and political supporters balk at his presidency, and should there be a state of chaos in Syria reminiscent of the mid 2000s, it's entirely possible that Russia will try to take the opportunity and to come back inside along with Iran most likely. And China is already on the ground looking for reconstruction projects and things like that, but still not without any interest in a prolonged military engagement. So we are seeing that uh, Russia for now is watching closely and waiting for Israel to make a mistake, which it keeps doing. Part of the reason it keeps doing that is that there is no coherent single strategy on Syria. There is a conflict between the intelligence approach and the political approach, and there's a conflict between trying to get Syria to join the Abraham Accords, or at least to come to some sort of a political arrangement, and the pressure from the internal truce preparation and from propaganda and from security establishment concerned about Syrian forces in the south and the spread of internal conflicts to Israel. So all of these conflicting priorities are resulting in an incoherent and inconsistent response to issues in Syria, and lack of clear intelligence on the level of coordination between the government and these militia attacks and internal interethnic sectarian struggles. So, given this lack of a comprehensive approach and a single strategy, it will be very easy on a tactical level to get Israel to make those mistakes and to manipulate the situation. And it's entirely possible that, as bad as the sectarian tensions are on their own, there are actors such as ex-Assad forces and pro-Russian voices who are trying to create an even bigger conflict if that's possible.
But Putin's first priority, I guess, would be to reinstall Assad, which is not feasible at the moment, but which could become feasible if ISIS gets strong enough to challenge Al-Sharaa for the power, and then a new war ensues, right?
I don't really see a military escalation involving Russia directly in the near future. I think it's what's more likely is that Turkey is going to try to take advantage of the current chaos to advance its own geopolitical interests. And let's remember that Russia is at a geographically disadvantageous position because Turkey controls the waterways near Syria and can block Russian ships from coming in, and the Iranian land route that would have previously allowed Russia to export whatever it needs to by land has been disrupted by the new government. So logistically, it's very difficult for Russia to really formally reassemble its presence without some sort of an agreement with al-Sharaa and his people, which may come, by the way, because all of these people are chameleon-like and will do business with whoever. Right now, they see it more advantageous to deal with the West because it's wealthier, it's more stable, and ideologically they're closer to Turkey, that which is a NATO member and which also derives benefit from these relationships. But this may change if um, the geopolitical situation changes, if, for instance, the Trump administration decides to stop supporting al-Sharaa and to become more concerned about the chaos and the spread of extremism on the ground, for instance, then the government will turn to China, Russia, and whoever they can for more assistance. That's likely to happen. I think Russia will do everything possible to instigate that politically, covertly, but in terms of formal open military forces, it's in a bad place right now. It's stretched thin.
It's in a bad place. Also, that's why I say that he would need Al-Sharaa to be weakened even more. And the best way to weaken, and the ones who are potentially in the best position to weaken Al-Sharaa is ISIS.
Well, we may be seeing the return of elements of ISIS. For instance, recently in Syria, they arrested members of an ISIS cell after an attack on a church in Damascus, a deadly attack that left over 20 people dead and injured. While officially the government is trying to crack down on ISIS, unofficially many of its members and affiliated militias share similar ideology and backgrounds. So how long are they going to be able to really fight that remains unclear. And whether al-Sharaa can manage the situation into a more stable direction seems increasingly unlikely because these elements seem to be getting the upper hand increasingly. Um, and I think it's only a matter of time before pro-ISIS elements start migrating in more mass numbers over the borders, or the foreign fighters who are already in will reconstitute uh, ISIS-like ideology internally, and maybe even welcome some of the ISIS sympathizers on the ground. I think the story is far from over. I think when the US claimed they destroyed ISIS in airstrikes, it was a very premature call because the ideology has not fully been eradicated. It is true that many of the Syrians are secularists, but it's also true that somebody like al-Sharaa and his cronies appeal to the more Islamist elements of the Syrian society, and they're more likely to invigorate that portion of the base and make them more active than previously.
Turkey, it seems their interest in Syria is more regional in the area of the East Turkey, so they don't try to influence Damascus. Is that correct?
Um, I do think Damascus is so dependent on Turkey for its political and economic support. Qatar more than Turkey, but why Turkey, I would say, and politically for sure Turkey. That I can say that Erdogan needs to directly influence, a regime that's already a partner. Does Al-Shabaab want some independence from Turkey? Sure, but it may not be possible in the long run for economic and political reasons, and due to the fact that he is unable to handle the security situation at the ground. And I think if it continues in that direction, and if parts of the country remain so uh, unruly, basically, and resistant and distrustful of the government, it's only a matter of time before Turkey moves in to become even more present militarily on the ground than it is now, and politically, it's already pushing and supporting a lot of the centralization initiatives, and um, and things like, for instance, trying to dismantle the SDF, trying to dismantle infrastructures that are partners to the PKK in Turkey.
Final question is getting back to our main issue was the evolution of the relationship between Russia and China. If I ask you, is possible to not completely, is because there has been too much bad blood running under the bridge, but to reasonably split it, to Putin from Xi Jinping. If I ask you how could that be possible, what would be your answer?
Uh, how it will be possible to
To split to a reasonable degree Putin from Xi Jinping. It's probably using the China's weak economy.
think I actually don't think that the economic factor will matter all that much. First of all, China's economy is not that weak. It has suffered losses, but let's not exaggerate. The regime is not about to fall apart.
No,
Millions
I
of
don't.
people, yeah. So I think so. So yes, sanctions could be a tactical leverage to some extent, but it's becoming less and less of a factor, especially since the Trump administration's tariff wars has weakened the West more than it weakened China. It has weakened transatlantic relations uh, more than it weakened China's economy, I would say. And China has consolidated its gains in Asian countries and in Asian sphere. So its economy may not be what it was once, but it's also not on the verge of any sort of major collapse that U.S. can easily, split Xi and Russia. That said, there are certainly points of tension, such as the mutual espionage and distrust on an intelligence level. And I think that's where, through covert operations and intelligence operation, the West has the most capabilities. The problem, once again, is that uh, the Trump administration stopped its cyber operations against Russian targets, which means that if there are joint operations between Russia and China, they likely will not be targeted by the US and stopped its cooperation with the European Union in that regard. The second issue, it has decimated its intelligence capabilities, with many seasoned officers leaving the force recently, so that constrains what US can do. NSA remains still actively engaged in anti-Chinese operations, but it's not the same thing as using intelligence to break up an alliance. There, it's where you need much more of a strategy and human specialists and people of that sort. So, as long as U.S. continues to treat China exclusively as an economic threat and Russia as not a threat at all, I doubt that we will see any major efforts in that regard. The UK may be able to do something, but not if the entire Five Eyes is weakened by US
on
positioning.
on the side of trade, maybe not the United States, but maybe Europe.
Actually, if anything, this is, this current situation and concern with Trump is bringing Europe closer to China, because with high tariffs and trade wars with the US, uh, China is a natural actor to step in. Yes, Europe is still trying to economically remove itself from Russia, but not as quickly as it should. And I'm not just talking about gas, I'm talking about metals. The exports for metals have not fallen in the last couple of years, and a year ago they've even risen. So until Europe finally designated aluminum as a under sanctions, but not the other metals. So until any trade with Russia continues at all, I don't really see that being a fully effective
I
strategy.
mean, the trade between China and Europe, especially now that both of them are under the threat of tariffs. And even now, Europe seems to be considering that Trump may not be willing to get an easy accommodation on the issue of tariffs. So there is a common interest that, but could that be exploited to isolate Putin to a degree?
I
Because
depends on who you ask, because US is not interested in isolating Putin. If anything, Trump has
yeah, no,
dabbled.
the United
Yeah.
States is not. That's correct. So that's why I say Europe and China.
Uh, uh, I mean, look, the thing is, China is so intent on helping Russia win the war in Ukraine that it
Mhm.
may likely bypass some of these opportunities, um, that it would normally embrace. I mean, I think, look, isolating Russia is easier said than done, because now Russia
Mhm.
is actually actively part of political lobbies in many European countries. Okay, Romania managed to not get a pro-Russian candidate elected, but there's still a lot of local uh, openness to Russian maneuvers. Uh, Orban is losing popularity in Hungary, but that doesn't mean he won't win the elections next year. Any sorts of dirty tricks are possible to maintain power. Vucic, despite mass protests in Serbia, is not going anywhere. Fico is not going anywhere. Um, and there's been the rise of AFD in Germany, which is deeply concerning. These trends favor Russia. And in the UK, the Reform Party, while still not where it would like to be, has gained a lot of influence, especially due to the economic mismanagement by the mainstream parties. So we are assuming that despite the anti-Russian resoluteness by the authorities, Russia is taking advantage of internal weaknesses to keep itself from being isolated. The fact that Europe can't get its act together on collective defense and security, the fact that corruption is rampant and there are still many oligarchs and their assets all over the place under different names and so forth. All of that says that the problem is much more deeply rooted than what than 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 what people understand. Uh, you know, Cutting off Russian gas will still take a couple, over 2 years, which means during those 2 years, Russia will still have a source of income from Europe. And Russian scientists and Chinese scientists and Iranian scientists are still very integrated into the academic base of the European Union and the US as well. So without getting, in the US, they're starting to crack down on some Chinese students, and they may get rid of some of the Chinese faculty here, but we don't know that that will happen for sure. And the only Russian faculty that has suffered any sort of consequence actually one anti-Putin scientist who the U.S. has been trying to expel back to Russia. So this is still not serious. The
So you
European
would,
Union,
hmm.
the
so
European efforts to isolate Russia are still not comprehensive, and there's still not a whole of society approach.
So you would say that any chance of getting into a deal with China to down, because Russia's economy depends on China. India's participation has grown, but it depends on China. And
Before we talk about
so you
any
would say that,
deals
so you
with
would
China,
say, oh, sorry. See,
hey, I was going to say that before any we discuss any deals with China, Europe at least has to figure out whether it's fully ready to isolate Russia or not. Because so far as Europe hasn't taken all the possible necessary measures to rid itself of Russian influence, how can it actually, make any serious strategy regarding other countries like China who are sympathetic and allies of Russia? Europe has to get serious first, and still is not there. That was my point of my previous comments. So yes, in an ideal world, maybe they would try to kind of use one against each other, and and cause tensions between them. But as I said, first, that's most likely to work only on intelligence level, because that alliance has gone so far unimpeded that now they are very much integrated and much more resilient to things like sanctions. So it's much more difficult to do it, even if you want to. But second, I'm not sure that Europe is wants to. I don't see them even taking themselves direct and easy steps to to decrease Russian influence or Chinese influence. So without taking basic steps, without doing the arithmetic, we can't talk about doing calculus.
yeah, well, that precondition you mentioned is unnecessary. But any chance of trying to get China to reign on Russia the same way they used to reign in North Korea is pretty much collapsed. So
I would say
the
it's
only
worse. Mhm.
no,
I would say it's worse than collapse because North Korea is actually now making inroads in Europe.
say again.
North Korea is now making inroads in Europe.
Yeah, and that started when Putin bypassed Xi Jinping to request the support for the Ukraine war, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's increasingly there are European embassies cooperating with North Korea on some level, not full normalization, but there is some dialogue going on, and North Korea is less isolated than it was, a decade ago, for instance. So I would say, if anything, North Korea is winning that round and kind of reintegrating itself, and um, yeah, I actually think the trend is likely to be the opposite. I think more likely than Russia and China being split by European Union, North Korea and other isolated regimes are more likely to find a foothold.
Yeah, so that unfortunate. So the only way out, unfortunately, is for Europe to get defense serious on defense. The only deterrent.
Not just defense and not just military deterrent, but also political awareness and willingness to put an end to any sort of influence, which means changing laws, which means lifting burdensome regulations on technological innovation. This means becoming much more doing a crackdown on radicalized groups, including groups radicalized by Russia, and Russia is involved in radicalization process and recruitment of of ideological assets. Yes, most people who go to Russia now are doing so for financial reasons or for reasons of getting political influence, opportunism. But the younger generations that are brainwashed against the West are very easy bait for Russian for the FSB, even if SVR, even if the Russian spies don't believe their own Kool-Aid.
Yeah, what you mentioned before is that to take more seriously projects like the Trans-Caspian, that so far I believe has reached up to Greece and Italy, but needs investments to extend through the to the rest of Europe, right? Or for instance, to reduce their dependence on Russian LNG or the metals you have mentioned before. So those are steps that are unavoidable if they are going to reduce their exposition to Russia's whims and imperial ambitions.
Look, the timelines for the European Union and for Russia are completely different.
Mhm.
Where the European Union still can't decide to what extent Russia is a threat, Russia is already planning for Baltic invasions. There's an aggressive campaign to dehumanize the Baltic peoples inside Russia. So Russia may be ready for a new invasion or some sort of a political coup long before the European Union will figure out what their priorities should be in that regard at the rate things are going. They're
Yeah,
operating on completely different realities, I would
yeah.
say.
Also, that means that also you would have to find alliances that go around the slowness and bureaucracy of Brussels because
Russia is
well,
already on the ground. Russia is already in multiple European countries, politically speaking. And meanwhile, none of these people have, developed any effective method to put an end to the growing momentum favoring Russia. And, a lot of these people are not going to openly say we are pro-Russia. They're going to say we are, against foreign aid or we are against wars. They're not going to say we love, Putin or we love the war in Ukraine. A lot of it is much more subtle and has degrees of separation.
yeah, well, that for instance, and those for instance those on average it takes 9 years for a country to be admitted to the European Union. So if you are talking about, I don't know, Greece, well, Greece is not that much, but when you are much of a problem. But when you are talking about countries like Georgia, who are more at the have Russia's neighbor, that means a lot because precisely Russia, in the case of Georgia, they vote in the last elections. They voted for the pro-Russian candidate because they looked that, despite Budapest, 1984, the West was not so committed after all to defend Ukraine, and that the access to the European market to take a lot, 9 years. So when it came to practical decisions, well, they just accommodated, like Finland with Stalin.
That's part of the reason. Another problem is that the European Union seems to forget that people vote more on internal issues than on the issues of foreign policy. Yes, in some small countries facing a direct threat, that may not be the case. But in most countries, think, Spain, Portugal, Italy, that are far removed from direct military attack by Russia, it's not going to be a priority. The priority is going to be internal concerns, and this is where countries like Russia can have a lot of influence because they're not seen as a direct threat, and they can exploit internal issues which are much more diverse than one problem. The West is already making that mistake in Taiwan. They think that Taiwan's only concern is China, whereas there's a lot of internal connected and unconnected internal issues that contribute to the political struggle between parties and the changing evolution of people's views. And failing to account for that leads to election results that people do not like. What happened in Japan? Japan is not obviously not in the European Union, but it's been seen as a fairly reliable right of center, ruling government, and now all of a sudden, populists like AFD are coming in, talking about developing nukes, talking about Japan first, and all of that. And the similar dynamic can happen in more European states if Brussels doesn't understand that their bureaucratization is what made Brexit possible. Yes, you could say that Russia got involved in that, just as it got involved with the separatists in Spain, but it doesn't mean there weren't any real grievances that people,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah,
So
Russia just used what Brussels gave them.
right now, the European Union is the only alternative to Russia, and hopefully, most people understand that, at least from an economic perspective, it's a far better alternative than what they would have otherwise. But there's a lot of resentment that this has become an excuse for the Brussels not to improve anything because they're de facto better than Russia and they're the only game in town. I think Brussels feels complacent about doing anything to strengthen internal resilience through active, political and economic reforms. And so long as it's the case, Russia can make incremental gains in its favor and split, a salami slice the European nations by working on the dissatisfied segments of the population.
Yeah,
What they the
on that they have proven to be very effective in the because, but it's as I said, it's because Brussels, Europe gave them a lot to work with. Because, for instance, the case of Eastern Germany, Eastern Germany had great expectations after the unification, and yet Eastern Germany remained a backwards region inside Germany, and that helped a lot to the AFD to to use the nationalistic playbook.
Exactly. As long as these dynamics are not changing or not changing fast enough, Russia can continue make gains even if it's far worse an alternative to the European Union. Even the poorest countries in Europe are better off than Russia at its, most of Russia for most Russians. But
Mhm.
nevertheless, that's not necessarily how voters think. If somebody gives them extra money, they don't compare themselves to how they would live in Russia because they have no intention of joining Russia and moving to Russia. They think that electing different candidates can help them exactly where they are. And if those candidates are backed by Russia, so what? It's not like, like they don't think that those candidates will mismanage the situation economically, just like Orban mismanaged Hungary or Vucic has mismanaged Serbia. They only think of what they see now, which is not great, versus what they're being promised.
Now, I would like to, before I give you the last word in the last 4 or 5 minutes, I would like to convoke you by, let's say, mid-August, the second week of August, to discuss the next episode of Trump's tariff soap opera.
Hmm, sure, absolutely. It keeps getting worse as far as I see. So I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss.
That's what I call it, soap opera. But if you like jokes, I also have written jokes for the channel. I could pass you a few links if you like to.
Yes,
Gi-
please.
oh yeah, so you can give me your opinion. But now, in the last 4 minutes, please give me your last word.
I would say that the idea of splitting the so-called dragon bear is good in practice, but in reality, it's only as good as the people's resources and willingness to implement it. And also, let's face it, China is not a better alternative to Russia. Even after you even if you somehow weaken that alliance, you may have a bigger problem because China, without Russia, will still pursue its own ambitions. Nor is it going to fully get rid of Russia, even if it stops funding, for instance, the war in Ukraine. It will still cooperate with Russia on overall intelligence and logistics. So there needs to be a realistic plan for understanding how to counter the negative influence of those countries and how to find economic and political alternatives to what they have to offer. Because so long as China feel and Russia feel that they have a strategy, an opening for some sort of involvement, that they're not fully isolated, they will exploit that, and they're not going to change and become suddenly more pro law and order. They only see that things working their way, either through active cooperation, which ignores their violations elsewhere, or even if there is a pushback, they still see that working jointly benefits them more than working separately to increase the positive momentum as well. So unless they're seen as a kind of part of of the same type of anti-Western threat, even if with different agendas, uh, and and they need to be fought jointly, I think the idea of splitting them up is not going to result in any major benefit in the long run. The long term strategy needs to involve a pro Western mindset, a return to understanding what the West and its allies stand for, and creating a framework that can push back against any ideological or economic attempt to reshape the world order in favor of authoritarian, anti-democratic, anti-capitalist, corrupt regimes.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately something that for about which I have no hope until 2029, and only in 2029 if the Democrats man up to and try to rescue the rules-based system they inherited from FDR, and about which they don't say even a peep because they are afraid of looking weak, or they are afraid of this, or they are afraid that they are always afraid of something,
Sure.
and that way you cannot reverse the influence of Donald Trump in foreign policy.
Yeah, unfortunately, until that happens, and but the Democrats won't be enough because they themselves are pushing increasingly radical candidates that don't have much broad appeal and will only exacerbate existing issues in their own way. So what needs to be is a coalition of centrists from both parties who
Yeah,
are.
as
Mm,
FDR was a centrist, and he precisely kept during the New Deal the most extremist actors aside. But that's why because he proposed something and delivered something that the Democratic establishment have failed miserably to do. Because candidates like Mandani would have not searched otherwise. Well, I have run out of time, and I will send you the jokes, and let's meet in the second week of August when we see how if Donald Trump kept again, or what did he happen to do.